September 28th, daylight. The monsters have overtaken the city. Somehow, I'm still alive.
A hero alone in the city of the undead. A ticking clock counting down to oblivion. And a monster dead set on destroying the ultimate survivor. When Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released on September 22, 1999, it quickly became one of the pillars of the Resident Evil franchise, combining the already cemented aspects of survival horror and puzzle solving with a more action-heavy approach to zombie terror. 21 years later, and Resident Evil fans revisited the end of Raccoon City with the release of the Resident Evil 3 Remake in 2020, a sleek, character-focused new approach that left fans polarized over how Capcom handled the games they've loved for decades. But both are the story of Jill Valentine and her last escape from the city of the dead, all while the villainous Umbrella Corporation unleashes their deadliest creation to silence a woman set on taking them down. And despite Resident Evil 3 being beloved by fans and helping to shape decades of games that followed, it first began as a humble side project that turned into one of the defining games of the franchise. It's a story of constant behind-the-scenes changes, small decisions that became franchise-defining ideas, and some of horror's greatest characters. Come with me as we return to Raccoon City to stand alongside Resident Evil's greatest hero and scariest villain. This is the story of Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, the underdog classic of the franchise.
I'll give you stars!
Unsurprisingly, the story of Resident Evil 3 begins with the success of RE2, but just as important was the odd timing of it all. Shortly after 2's successful release, Sony announced the development of the PlayStation 2, with a 1999 release date given for the next step in gaming. Of course, with a new system came the need for new games, and Capcom, having essentially completely turned around their fortunes with the success of the Resident Evil games, needed to have an entry ready for the launch of this new system. Hideki Kamiya, director of RE2, quickly jumped on developing a new game for the PlayStation 2, only for Sony to push its launch to the year 2000. With Capcom suddenly in the lurch, looking at a gap between game releases, and new horror rivals popping up in the forms of Parasite Eve and Silent Hill, the company decided to make a spin-off game they could develop fast and release during this transition period. The strategy? 5 different RE games were commissioned in early 1998. Among these was the game then referred to as Resident Evil 1.9, with Shinji Mikami choosing Kazuhiro Aoyama as its director. Aoyama had previously worked as a system planner on RE1 and 2, making him very familiar with the game engine, a skill that would be absolutely necessary as the game that became Nemesis would have a small budget, a smaller team, the need to reuse RE2's graphics engine and assets, and a 1-year turnaround in development from concept to release, thanks to Capcom's demands. With other established veterans busy, recent hire Yasuhisa Kawamura was brought on to write the game's story. The concept? A prequel to RE2 set the day before Leon and Claire's arrival, and starring 3 Umbrella mercenaries, hence the 1.9 title. Obviously, you can see some of that DNA in the finalized 3, but it's also something Capcom can't seem to get away from, with both the Outbreak games and the disastrous Operation Raccoon City coming back to the idea years later. The concepts for those 3 mercenaries eventually evolved into Carlos Oliveira, Nikolai Genovese, and Mikhail Victor. But when Kawamura was given the go-ahead to include Jill Valentine as a recurring character, everything changed. The story was initially supposed to just be an escape chronicle from an infected Raccoon City, said Kawamura, but after discussions with Mikami and Aoyama, it was decided that instead of introducing a new character, Jill Valentine will play the role of the main character. As development progressed, the game was eventually turned into half prequel to RE2, half sequel, with the development name given as Resident Evil 1.9 Plus 2.1, letting us see the end of Raccoon City after 2's lack of resolution. But it was also around this time that Capcom was looking to become a publicly traded company and needed a big hit to boost investor confidence. Eventually, the call was made by Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto to officially make the game a main entry, and christen it with the prestigious 3 in the title, a move that caught both Aoyama and Mikami off guard, as they had up to then approached the game as an offbeat, not mainstream appealing, fresher take on Resident Evil. According to Mikami, the basic idea was to make an indie Resident Evil game. Aoyama's game was supposed to target underground, hardcore fans of Resident Evil, who didn't care if the game was weird or quirky. As such, with only 2 months to go until launch, Okamoto requested more content be added to the game to lengthen it and make it feel more on par with RE2. The Raccoon City Park with the Gravedigger fight and the Dead Factory, both areas near the end of the game, were expanded the most, adding half an hour to the game's playtime, and it kinda makes sense when you play it. After Carlos saves Jill from the T-Virus, it feels like we're heading toward our final confrontations with Nemesis and Nikolai, as we find out a nuclear missile strike is coming, only for our pass through the park and Dead Factory to become much more complicated and slower than expected. There's still cool sections, but the pacing is a little odd here. Still, despite complications, the team was able to hit their release window in Japan, with RE3's launch in the US and Europe delayed to avoid heavy competition. Put that all together and you have our finalized game.
It's in your blood. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The nightmare continues. Only from Capcom.
Named Biohazard 3 Last Escape in Japan, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in the United States, the story begins on September 28, 1998, as Jill Valentine, former member of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service Division and our returning hero from the original Resident Evil, finds herself surrounded by hordes of the undead in Raccoon City, with the Umbrella Corporation's T-Virus spreading throughout the town and turning it into a nightmare. But with Jill alone and in the midst of her last escape, our heroine is soon targeted by the bioorganic weapon called Nemesis, which has been created to kill her and any other remaining STARS member. Thankfully, Jill finds an ally in Carlos Oliveira, a mercenary and member of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service sent in to save as many people as possible. But escape won't be easy when fellow UBCS member Nikolai Genovese betrays them, as Nemesis can't be stopped by any conventional weapon. With just hours left until a nuclear missile wipes out Raccoon City, Jill and Carlos must depend on each other to escape. Compared to the games that came before, Nemesis is smaller, it's faster, it's more action-heavy, and its story is less complicated. Jill Valentine is fully aware of Umbrella's corruption and Raccoon City is already infected. From there, it's a story focused on escape, taking us from the city's downtown and uptown areas to its police departments, to its iconic clock tower, to its hospital and park, before we descend into Umbrella's hidden Dead Factory, the covert biohazard disposal unit at the center of the outbreak. Of course, the idea of a zombie-ridden Raccoon City had already been introduced in RE2, but that's essentially window dressing for that game, as it mostly takes place inside the Raccoon Police Department and then in Umbrella's underground facility, with a little connective tissue to show what's happening outside. It's a convention that comes from sticking to the formula of the original Resident Evil and its slowly unfolding puzzle of the mansion. And given the two ends with our heroes escaping the city, but the necropolis itself still fully infected, there was plenty more potential left in Raccoon City. So what makes RE3 so exciting is that right from the start we are out on the city streets, fighting to survive, and surrounded by hordes of the undead. It's no longer a trickle of zombies. RE3 uses blind corners, tight alleys, and exploding windows to have you suddenly face to face with so many zombies. Still, the heart of Resident Evil is here. Like I've discussed in many other videos, this is still the story of one long dark night, just split across several days, that leads our heroes down into the deep hidden corruption beneath it all, only to come back out into the light of day, destroying the evil with one last gigantic explosion. It's just that this explosion is a nuclear strike that wipes out the city, adding a layer of tragedy to our survival. Gameplay-wise, RE3 is still exactly in the classic mold of the franchise. Pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls, and static shots. There's even some entire areas like the police station reused from RE2. A shortcut to save time and money, but also a cool Easter egg that ties us to Leon and Claire's story. Game devs, if you ever have to recycle elements from past games, just call it an Easter egg. The kids will love it. To counterbalance the game's lack of budget and new features, Aoyama decided to push RE3 into a much more action-heavy direction. Now, by the standards set by Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, Nemesis feels pretty sparse, but it's still a major step up from the original RE1 and 2. Here, the zombies are faster, the encounters are more plentiful, and Jill can now dodge attacks and push enemies away. The result is a faster game designed around a more proactive character in an even more dangerous situation. That action-focused gameplay is also reflected in the new live selection feature, where important moments in the game make players choose between two options at a moment's notice: stay and fight Nemesis or run away, jump out the trolley window or pull the emergency brake. Each decision has some degree of impact on how the game progresses and which characters are encountered, although only a few things have a real impact on the details of the story. Of course, players can also choose to do nothing, which often results in them taking damage and highlighting the need for fast decision making. The idea was for players to be able to complete the game in just one playthrough, like an arcade game, said Aoyama. These new additions were intended to give the game more replay value. And if you're an experienced RE player, you can probably beat Nemesis in under 6 hours and even faster on replays. And that consistent pressure leads us to the big new addition that really defines RE3, Nemesis. While Resident Evil 2 included a pursuer character in the form of Mr. X, this was really a piece of bonus content for replayability that was only a small part of the game. In RE3, Nemesis becomes the defining element of the game. A gigantic, unstoppable, mutated tyrant equipped with a rocket launcher that has been unleashed by Umbrella to kill as many members of Raccoon City's STARS division as possible. Gameplay-wise, Nemesis is spawned through both scripted segments and randomized spawns, with the enemy able to open doors and chase players throughout areas. The first time this happens to you, you will freak out. Putting him down will let you pick up items from his body and get a moment to breathe, but Nemesis will be back up again soon, slowly mutating due to continued damage. And out of all Resident Evil villains made in both the years before and since, Nemesis is easily one of the most iconic in the entire franchise, crossing over into mainstream recognition and becoming an emblem of the franchise despite only appearing in one mainline game, but also showing up in other RE games like Survivor 2 and Umbrella Chronicles, becoming a playable character in later Marvel vs. Capcom games, and showing up in the Resident Evil Apocalypse movie where he actually looks really awesome, but also briefly becomes a good guy before being squashed under a helicopter like a little jabroni. Don't do my main man like this, Paul. So, why do we love Nemesis so much? Well, I think it's a combination of an incredible design and concept, the fear this character strikes in players, and a sense of pity that rises as the game goes on. Collectible files show us that Nemesis is the result of Umbrella taking a T-103 Tyrant, the same type of monster we fight at the end of the original RE, and implanting an NE-alpha parasite into it, which essentially takes over the giant's brain for higher intelligence, allowing it to follow complex commands. It also results in Nemesis slowly mutating due to continued damage, losing its human form and becoming a tentacle-covered beast, and eventually a massive blob in the remake. To me, Nemesis becomes more pathetic in the original, losing its arm and eventually its head, but unable to stop pursuing Jill because of its commands, while it gets scarier and less sympathetic in the remake, turning into an out-of-control, all-consuming monster. And while some don't like his new look in the remake, I like both, with Nemesis clearly being this stitched-together prototype monstrosity akin to Frankenstein's monster. its only form of expression an unforgettable focus of its rage. Every Resident Evil game, whether it takes place in a spooky mansion or an infected city or a war-torn village or a gothic castle, always comes back to corrupt companies and evil billionaires exploiting science and the public for their own gain. The only difference with RE3 is that the cat is essentially out of the bag, and Umbrella's efforts to both cover up the mansion incident and stop the spreading infection caused by their experiments has failed, and led to all of RC going to hell. And while we're at it, let's list Umbrella's crimes as implicated by Resident Evil 3. Of course, there's the whole zombie outbreak that kills either tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands depending on which game we're talking about, but even before then, Umbrella essentially owned the city, putting its cronies in power and manipulating every aspect of the town as part of its experiments. Then there's unleashing Nemesis to specifically kill any remaining STARS members as revenge for the Spencer Mansion. There's the creation and severe mismanagement of the Dead Factory, which was designed to dispose of all bioweapon waste, but essentially contaminates all of the city, leading to all kinds of new horrors. Deep underground, the remakes reveal multiple Umbrella labs where their growing horrors all reside, just waiting to break out and cause new atrocities. And when Raccoon City falls, Umbrella sends in mercenaries as part of its UBCS team under the guise of helping survivors, only for this to be part of their plan to cause more chaos and see what their experiments can do against elite soldiers. So yeah, Umbrella is crazy evil, and Nemesis is the first game to have us confront them from start to finish. Both RE1 and 2 star characters who don't fully grasp what's going on until close to the end. But with Jill fully aware of Umbrella's experiments and targeted by them, the game takes on a different approach. And I think that's part of what makes Jill into a truly great character here, locked in combat with Nemesis deep within the City of the Dead. Nemesis's involvement also draws our attention to a shortcoming of RE3. There's only 2 actual bosses in the entire game, my main man and the Gravedigger. Another classic mutated and massive animal in the form of a giant worm burrowing through the city's park. But given the continual encounters with Nemesis, it's easy to not notice at first until you realize that the game is essentially lacking the general sense of the horror of discovery that's integral to most other RE games. And for those that miss the confined, musty clockwork approach of 1 and 2, the clock tower essentially acts as a mini version of the mansion, as Jill and then Carlos must work their way through the building and its many strange puzzles to call for a helicopter rescue. That doesn't go well, of course, but it also leads to one of RE3's big twists.
Jill! Hang in there! What have I done? I'm sorry, Jill. Please, wake up!
With Jill attacked and infected by Nemesis, Carlos arrives to rescue her and find a vaccine for the T-virus. This causes Jill to be unconscious for 3 days, during which time Resident Evil 2 takes place, until Carlos cures her. Not much else is really done with this T-virus cure in the franchise, although later entries will show that it's merely dormant in Jill. But the remake uses this in a way that really adds to Jill's story, but I'll discuss that in a few minutes. At RE3's Climax, the player makes several crucial decisions as the US government's nuclear missile closes in on Raccoon City. Negotiate with the fleeing Nikolai, or shoot him down. Finish off Nemesis, or run. In any case, Jill is able to put an end to the monster with an experimental railgun. And, if you made the right choice, hit us with one of the best lines in the franchise.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
And from there, Carlos and Jill escape just in time, with some help from Barry Burton depending on the choice, who did not die when I accidentally let Lisa Trevor push him off a cliff in the remake, with Raccoon City wiped out in the blast and Jill swearing to take down Umbrella.
Umbrella's going down.
Also, special shout out to composers Masami Ueda and Saori Maeda. Their score for RE3 is awesome. And this end credits song is that perfect hit of peace and resolution we all need. Despite its smaller budget and rush production, Nemesis was a big hit, going on to sell 3.5 million copies worldwide on the PlayStation. And while that's a drop from 2's 4.9 million, its lower budget actually caused 3 to be more profitable. And I think that, at least until the release of the remakes, 3 had a much bigger imprint on fans of the franchise than 2. Personally speaking, Nemesis and Jill are much more represented in fan celebrations, merchandise, and just generally what all the kids were talking about at school when I was young than most anything else from RE1 and 2. And I think that comes down to the iconography of these two characters and the terror of their battle across the city. Yes, RE3 still has plenty of that cheese and stiff line readings like prior entries.
Calm down, lady. I'm no zombie. My name's Carlos, Corporal of Umbrella's Biohazard Countermeasure Force. What's your name?
Jill, did you just say you belong to Umbrella's army?
But it's a little darker, a little grimier, a little more intense, adding a weight to the series that I think really bridges the gap between these early games and the darkness of the RE1 remake and what came next. After the release of Resident Evil 3, Capcom would take the franchise in many different directions. The center of the series so far, Raccoon City, was gone forever, and now we would see what these games would be like without the story that had defined the first 3 entries so far. Up next would be Code Veronica, finally pushing the franchise into a new platform, as well as the RE1 remake and Zero for the GameCube. A strange time for the series as it waited on a fresh new direction to be decided. But over the course of the next 20 years, Resident Evil would give life to many different spin-off titles that finally fulfilled Nemesis' original vision, continue a mainline series that would ping-pong back and forth between action and horror, and finally decide to remake the early games for a new generation of fans and a new style of gameplay. In 2015, Capcom officially began work on remaking Resident Evil 2, using the RE engine that had been developed for RE7 and using a third-person perspective like Resident Evil 4 to create a more action-heavy game. And while RE2 was still in development, Capcom decided to move forward with remaking 3 as well, knowing they had a hit on their hands and fans would only want more remakes, officially announcing the game on December 10th, 2019, and releasing it on April 3rd, 2020.
Jill, over here!
Directed by Kiyohiko Sakata and with video game studios Redworks Inc., M2 Inc., and K2 Co. Limited working alongside Capcom R&D Division 1 due to Capcom's concurrent work on the RE2 remake, this new take on Resident Evil 3 tells essentially the same story, with Jill Valentine suspended from the RPD due to her solo investigation into Umbrella's involvement in the Spencer Mansion, and RE3 throwing us right into the chaos, with Nemesis busting into Jill's apartment and her fighting to survive in a crumbling Raccoon City. Like the remake of 2, 3's remake takes a lot of the same plot beats, character arcs, and game mechanics, while transposing them into a modern approach. But it's also a lot more linear and more stylistically in line with RE4's combat-heavy, set-piece-to-set-piece rhythm. Like a lot of modern game studios, Capcom's Resident Evil team leaned heavily into a cinematic approach with most games made in the 2010s and after, and RE3 is the team making the game into something as cinematic as possible, with a heavy emphasis on big moments, character beats, and scripted enemy encounters. That's really not what the original 3 was like, especially with its pursuer essentially being a really tough regular enemy instead of a scripted boss. And the many changes made fans real mad. So, what are the main setbacks of RE3R? Well, mainly it's an issue of cut content. The remake essentially forgoes most aspects of puzzle solving, turning the first half of Discovery and unlocking the downtown and uptown portions of Raccoon City into a straightforward fight. The entirety of the clock tower is also gone, probably the change that made fans the most upset given that the game teases it, and moving Carlos and Jill's switch fully into the hospital. There's no more live selection to have the story play out in different ways. The park and Dead Factory are gone in favor of a new nest under the hospital that plays host to our final fight to save Raccoon City. And most importantly, Nemesis is no longer a true pursuer character, but instead is a recurring boss fight, really only playing pursuer in one section before showing up for specific fights later on. Obviously, Capcom bundled RE3R with Resident Evil Resistance to make up for the fact that the game wasn't nearly as big as Resident Evil 2, but, well, nobody really gave a shit about Resistance. It's also a more bombastic and blockbuster approach to the story to complement its over-the-shoulder action-heavy gameplay. Moments like the train explosion or the fight with an all-fours Nemesis that runs across buildings, or Jill grabbing a massive railgun to destroy our bad guy, are much larger than life and way bigger than most things in the original version, which, despite its big stakes, still feels a little smaller. But I guess that's just a version of RE that I love. I love when Leon backflips to get away from chainsaw-wielding sisters. I love when Chris and Shiva shoot double rockets to blow up Wesker in an active volcano. And I really love this moment.
Next time, take the fucking hit!
I totally understand the critiques of RE3R. It's too short, there's a lot of beloved locations and moments that are missing, and the lack of features, especially coming after Mr. X was turned into a great new pursuer in RE2R, are disappointing, especially when Capcom hasn't made the original RE3 available on modern platforms. If these elements were included with this modern approach, I think that RE3R would easily rank among the best of the series with the other remakes. But the thing is, I'm one of those sick freaks that loves the Resident Evil 3 remake. Why? Well, I think that this is a really fun, really engaging zombie survival story that does a lot of great things with the Jill Valentine character. To me, Jill is the main character of the Resident Evil franchise because of her place at the center of RE1 and 3, being one of the first people to discover the truth behind the Spencer Mansion, and being the last survivor of Raccoon City. Honestly, I really find Capcom's replacement of Jill at the center of RE with Chris Redfield to be frustrating, and a move that makes the franchise less unique. Chris is just a boulder-punching meathead, while Jill becomes a haunted final girl looking for revenge and justice. In RE3R, Jill's haunted nature is put much more at the center of the story, putting us inside her nightmares and making us realize that her fight to survive Raccoon City is something that changes from a fight to save as many people as possible to a mournful end to the city she loves. And about that T-virus cure. Just like the original, Jill is infected by Nemesis and needs Carlos to find a cure, which still happens in the hospital. However, realizing that a cure is possible, Jill's mission in the second half of RE3R is to find a vaccine sample to stop the nuclear attack, which she discovers deep within the Nest lab.
How long do we have?
Hours, maybe.
Then let's not waste one more second.
To me, this adds a lot more to Jill's heroism, as there's still hope to save the city and Jill is now fighting for its future. But in the end, the sample is destroyed by Nikolai, leaving Raccoon City to its nuclear fate.
No! Do you have any idea what you've just done?
To me, this adds so much to Jill's story, with her fight to survive arcing from hopeless to hopeful, and then back to accepting the end of her city, while still making her a great hero, ending Nemesis, stopping Nikolai, and vowing to take down Umbrella. Together, voice actress Nicole Tompkins and character model Sasha Zatova make Jill into a living, breathing character in ways she wasn't able to be in previous versions. And while I enjoy Catherine Disher's voice performance in the original Nemesis, it's a little flatter, a little more cartoonish.
It was Raccoon City's last chance, and my last chance. My last escape.
Still miles better than what we had in the original 1 and 2, but there's still improvements to be made to Jill as a character, and what was capable for telling her journey in this specific story. Yes, there's plenty more that should have been done with RE3R, which essentially became a rush job reusing 2's gameplay system, just like what had been done with the original 3, but I love its story of fighting to save Raccoon City, only for everything to be lost beyond pure survival. To me, it's one of my favorite modern zombie stories in any medium. There's this recurring arc to basically every returning RE protagonist that sees them as at least somewhat hopeful in their first appearance, only to become haunted shells of themselves because of their experiences. It's not as tragic as it sounds because they're also action heroes on wild adventures, but it happens over and over. Leon is a much darker character as a veteran agent in 4, especially in the remake. Chris is the darkest by 8 because of so many tragedies. Jill also experiences this, but her arc mostly happens off-screen. RE3 hints at her being haunted by the Spencer Mansion in her journal entries, while RE5 has her mostly either presumed dead or our mind-controlled enemy, only for the character to temporarily retire after the game. Bad move, Capcom. Real bad move. And that's why I think Remake really stands out among Jill's games. giving the character a lot of time to be shaken by the Spencer Mansion, be forced into action by the zombie plague, and become a proactive hero trying to save the city. I really just wish we had more Jill in these games, because aside from Revelations, her story has basically been put on pause until the Dead Island movie brought her back into the action. Just like the original version, RE3R ends with Raccoon City wiped off the face of the earth with a nuclear attack, destroying the city of zombies and any proof of what exactly happened here. But it also gives us a moment with Jill's reflection, a promise to not forget what Umbrella did to the city and the people she loved. And with a brief moment after the credits, we're left wondering where Jill's story will go next if Capcom continues to remake their games. By the time of this video, the Resident Evil 3 remake has sold 9.6 million copies, a step down from the 2 remake like its predecessor, but a strong number in the recent Resident Evil Renaissance post-7. The Residentaissance, if you will. It's now been 5 years since the release of the Resident Evil 3 remake, and while the franchise has carried on with the release of Village and the RE4 remake, there's very little known about where the series will go from here. But no matter what happens next, Jill Valentine's story in Resident Evil 3 will always have a special place at the center of this franchise. Whether it's in the classic PlayStation game or the modern remake, what I find so compelling about Resident Evil 3 is its story of one woman's desperate fight to not just survive, but make a difference when all hope seems lost. And what we're left with when we lose everything. For Jill Valentine, Raccoon City may be gone, but the fight against Umbrella has only just begun. Thanks for watching today's video, and I'm finally back talking about Resident Evil. You may be aware that I did Resi-December Evil for 2 years in a row, but decided not to do it in 2024. But just because I'm not doing a month of Resident Evil videos doesn't mean I'm done talking about my favorite game franchise. I'm such a massive fan of the RE games that I couldn't possibly stop there. And with it being the 5th anniversary of RE3R, I thought it would be the perfect time to finally talk about RE3. And while the remake has a lot of strong opinions about it, I really do enjoy both versions of this game. To me, it is a classic within the larger franchise, and you really can't beat Jill Valentine and Nemesis when it comes to both the heroes and villains of the franchise. I've done videos on Resident Evil 2 and the fall of Raccoon City in general, but I really just want to talk about RE3 in particular, because really to me this is one of the defining games of the entire franchise. And growing up, when I was still too scared to play these games, I already knew who Jill Valentine and Nemesis and what Raccoon City was. They were that instantly iconic that they immediately transferred over into the mainstream. While I wouldn't say that either version of RE3 is my favorite game in the franchise, I still put Resident Evil 4 up at the top, with the remake probably being the best version of that game. I just have a lot of fondness for this story. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about Resident Evil 3, as well as what other RE topics you'd like for me to talk about, and any other video game topics in general. As far as the mainline games go, I still have Resident Evil 5, 6, and 8 to talk about, and I will get around to those eventually. But seeing as this is a massive ongoing franchise for about 30 years now, there's still so much I could talk about regarding all of Resident Evil. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron or member, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video, as well as exclusive reviews voted on every month by my members and patrons, with the latest one being a look back at the Back to the Future trilogy. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and playing some great Resident Evil games.
I decided then and there, the ashes of Raccoon City would be Umbrella's ashes too. I would end them, once and for all.